So today I'm here to talk about the top 10 fantasy books that I read this year that were published before 2023. These are books I refer to as backlist books, and I've already done this for science fiction and dark books, so definitely go check out those videos, which should be live, and I'll be talking about my favorite books published in 2023 closer to Christmas, so hopefully you stick around. All that being said, let's get started. First, at the number 10 spot, we have Every Heart a Doorway by Sean McGuire, the first book in the Wayfarer Children's series. This is a bind above the first three, but specifically I'm putting the first novella on the list because I find it to be the strongest. If you don't know, this novella series follows a group of children that go through different doorways and then return back. So basically it is a conversation surrounding portal fantasy, playing off the idea of children who go through wardrobes or holes in the ground and meet these other fantastical beings, find these other amazing places, and what happens when they actually come back to our reality. Many of them are changed, many of them prefer the other world to their own and are simply different people, and so their parents don't know what to do with them and essentially send them off to this boarding school to try to get them fixed. And within the boarding school, they acknowledge that they actually know that this is happening, the children are not going crazy, and they are given a safe haven. So this is a novella that I read many years ago, and I fully admit that it wasn't a favorite the year that I read it because I didn't quite understand what the author was doing. Rereading it now, it has absolutely become a favorite. I really appreciate it so much more, so I'm going to allow myself to put it on this list because whenever I reread a book that wasn't previously a favorite and it becomes one, I'll give it a chance to highlight it here. And what I like about this series is I first think it's a great book to recommend to those of you that are already fantasy readers, because you probably grew up reading these portal fantasy stories and now you're having a story that's reflecting on that and really questioning, well, what happens when we send these children on these crazy adventures and then expect them to go back to their normal lives, and they can't possibly just forget everything and instead have to deal with that. And then of course within the story there is a larger layer of social commentary on a lot of the discussions that are happening right now about parents and not necessarily recognizing or understanding how their children are identifying in different ways that don't make sense to them. So if you want to read on a very surface level, it is a story about children going into portals and coming back. But if you want to read it at a higher level, there's a lot more underneath the surface, but it's not done in a way that is really in your face. Instead, it's kind of there if you're looking for it, and once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it because it is very much woven into the story. And there's a lot of good conversation in the first book. There is a mystery element, which again ties back into the themes very nicely, and it just starts off this really fantastic series. I really enjoyed the book that came out this year as well, which might make a spot on my favorites list depending on how the year wraps up, but I do recommend this series to those of you that are looking for something that's kind of a commentary on both our world and fantasy worlds, and it's just a really smart little package. Next at number 9, we have The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon, and this is a bit of a booktube darling. You probably know it as the lesbian story involving dragons that everyone cheers about online. The basic synopsis is that it's set in a world where there's an evil that is coming back, and so people have to get together and try to stop this. A very classic fantasy story in terms of a tropey setup, but I think it works really well again because it brings in some of those newer elements, having the characters be of different sexualities, and of course actually a story with dragons. There's something very novel about a fantasy story these days that actually has dragons and has some really satisfying aspects with that as well within the story, which I don't feel like people talk about enough. There's also a seafaring aspect, which I personally loved. The world is rich, the characters are well developed, and it's one that I very much enjoyed going through, and I think that it is popular for a reason, and it works as a standalone if you don't want to read the prequel. So I personally do recommend it. I know so many other people have, but I will admit that I think the hype is worth it. I think it's a good book. It earned a spot on this list, and I will definitely read more by this author. Next at number 8, we have Illborn by Daniel T. Jackson, and this is the start of a new epic fantasy series where years ago there was this lord who came out and with his divine powers forced these people to be put together and used his power in that way. Now fast forward, I believe 800 years, the world has pretty much banished the use of magic, or at least it has become forbidden, and so we follow the story from 4 different perspectives of individuals who have secret powers that they are coming to terms with, and of course they're not able to keep those powers secret much longer, in which case they are forced to give up the lives that they have known and confront the past that is coming quickly for them. This is a story that I really liked for a lot of reasons. First off, the prologue, as I said before, is absolutely gripping. I was immediately hooked in. It's dark, it's gritty, and it's very much character based. So as you can imagine with a story like this, you're going to spend time with these 4 different characters characters, but I really liked each of their perspectives. And again, the world that they are written into is very dark and brutal at times. And I'm always someone who's interested in a fantasy world that explores the terrible side of humanity and those trying to struggle and survive within it. So anything along those lines is completely up my alley. I thought it was a really strong book. It's relatively long, but I flew through it and found it very interesting, easy to read, accessible, but with very good prose and really just, again, the whole package I'm looking for in something like this. So I recommend it. I think it's great, and I do plan to continue on with the later books when I get a chance. Then at number 7, we have Age of Ash by Daniel Abraham, and this is the start of a fantasy series where we follow a young woman who is a petty thief in the city. Something happens to her brother, he is killed, and then she goes off to try to find out what happened. And of course, in doing so, it kind of brings about a larger story that she gets pulled into. This is one that I picked up partially because of the author's name. I really love the Expanse series, but I've never tried out their fantasy, and I'm really glad I did, because I must say their writing in terms of fantasy, their world building, all of that is very distinct to what I see in the Expanse in a way that I find very exciting. I really like the urban setting of the story. While it's set in a secondary world, I love that most of the story takes place in that very intimate place, and you really get a feeling of the city being dark and gritty, especially getting the story told from a perspective of someone who is in the underbelly of society at the start. And so you get to see all of that messiness, and I love that aspect of the story. The main protagonist herself I thought to be immediately likable, relatable, not a stereotype, but really a fully fleshed out person with weaknesses and strength and so forth. And the mystery itself I thought was quite good. I was overall really impressed by this one. It's definitely got me interested in reading this author's backlist in terms of their fantasy work, and I thought the writing was rich, the characters, all of those elements again came together really nicely for me, and I would love to see more by this author at this point. Then at number 6, we have God's War by Cameron Hurley, and this is a sci fantasy story that follows a woman named Nyx who, along with her mercenary crew, are doing a job and they get in trouble and are forced to deal with the situation that they get themselves into. This is a story that involves aliens. It is technically considered to be science fiction, but in my mind, while it is framed around a science fiction world or universe, really the narrative reminds me much more of fantasy, and there are magical elements to the story that definitely make it a crossover between the two. So my point is that I technically could have included it in my science fiction list that I posted already, but I'll be honest, I needed more books for this list because I had so many good science fiction books to choose from already, and this one was easy to pull over because it does really cross the line between the two genres. Now, if you're not aware, at this point I've become a huge fan of Cameron Hurley's work. I've read several of their books, both in science fiction and fantasy, and at this point want to read everything else that they have written. I will be honest that I don't think that this is the place to start with their work. I love this book, but I loved it because I love what Cameron Hurley does, and they create the most incredible dark, gritty worlds, and they give you the world building in a way that I've come to really enjoy, where it is not spoon-fed to the reader. Instead, we have to slowly figure it out ourselves, and quite honestly, we don't always figure it out ourselves entirely, or at least I did not. This book in my mind is very messy in terms of everything that is going on, and you just have to figure it out as you go along, and I did not pick up every piece that the author laid down because honestly, I don't think that they necessarily gave us every piece of information in this first book, and definitely I think the author has an idea of what this world looks like, but again, they're not looking to provide big info dumps and instead drop the reader into the story and let them kind of figure it out as they go along, which I find to be very enjoyable as I've gotten further into fantasy and science fiction. The characters themselves are well-rounded, dynamic individuals that have their own moral codes, their own motivations, their challenges and so forth, and they're not black and white. They're not simple stereotypes or just flat ideas on the page. Instead, they really do feel like individuals. And so those are the elements I love so much about Cameron Hurley, and I love this in their work. But I will be honest that I think there are better works that are a little bit more precise in terms of the world building and what it's trying to do, that I think will be more satisfying place for other people to start. But if you're like me and are reading through all of Cameron Hurley's work, this is definitely one you don't want to miss. I wouldn't start here, but you definitely can finish here because I really enjoyed it. I loved it based off my reading taste, so I do hope that some of you check it out when you get a chance. Then moving into the top 5, we we have the Night Angel trilogy, which starts with The Way of Shadows, all by Brent Weeks. And this is a backlist series I read for the first time this year, and I personally really enjoyed it. It follows a man who was raised on the street, and then at the beginning of the story gets an opportunity to be trained as an assassin, and the story goes from there. I do understand that this trilogy is relatively controversial. People either love it or hate it, or I guess fall somewhere in between, but there definitely is a range of opinions, and I'm sure that's going to be the case with you watching it. So let me just explain why I love it so much. A lot of that comes from the fact that I really like the other author's series, Lightbringer. I think that it does a lot of amazing things that work very well for me, and I definitely saw threads of that in this work. Not quite as polished. I would say that the other series is stronger. If I had read it this year, it would have been on this list at a higher position. But for me, a story that feels similar to the Lightbringer series is very much up my alley because I love the author's humor. The back and forth, the banter between the characters is always phenomenal, which you get a lot of within the story. There's a lot of humor to it. At the same time, the world that the author drops us into is very brutal in nature, which you're probably noticing from this list is something that I like. And so because of that, I like the fact that the characters are put in dangerous situations. Now I know for other readers that was a huge turnoff. Not everyone likes to have characters that are in harm's way, especially the women in the story are put in tough positions. His stories definitely draw from a lot of chauvinistic traditions of history where women were actually in these roles. So I do not mind it because it feels authentic to the world that he's creating, and I don't think it's the author's voice on the page and his opinions on women. As I've said before, I don't read his books for the female representation, but I also don't find anything off-putting in this book in terms of how it's being done. And again, I am someone who loves the series of A Song of Ice and Fire, so I cannot be critical of a series like this and then go ahead and give that series a pass. So for me, I loved the action scenes. I always think that I'm not someone who enjoys assassin fantasy, but I enjoyed this one quite a bit. Again, I like the characters, the banter, the humor. For me, it was the right balance between being a fun story and also serious enough. Often if a story is funny, it can be so funny that I don't care deeply for the characters or at least worry for them. But this one had enough action on the page that it really kind of worked for me, and I was excited and worried and just didn't really know what was going to happen next. I'm holding up the first book, but I have read all three in the original trilogy as well as a new release. And overall, I like these. I think that they're doing some really great things. I'm really glad I got a chance to read them for the first time because, again, a lot of people have a lot of vocal things to say online, so sometimes you just gotta try a series for yourself and it might end up being a favorite. Then at number 4, we have The Emperor's Soul by Brandon Sanderson. This, of course, is a well-known fantasy novella that follows a woman who works as a forger. She is caught and then is forced to attempt to forge or create the soul of this dead king. And you find out that within this world, that forgery is impossible. And she really doesn't believe she can necessarily do it, but she's in a position where she has to do it or she'll be killed. And so she goes along and tries her best to follow through with that process. And so we follow the story from her perspective as she's trying to do almost two things at the same time. She's trying to do the impossible, and then she's also trying to figure out how to get out of the situation and survive. And so we follow her as she's going through these steps and also trying to negotiate and speak with the people who are keeping her captive and trying to wiggle her position from there. If you don't know, one of my favorite things about Brandon Sanderson is his magic systems, and so a whole novella that is focused around the magic and how it works was really pleasing to me because it basically was a really tight story with no fat that focused on the element I love the most in his work. And as I've often said, what I like about short work is simply the fact that I have less to criticize. I find that as long as it's done well, there's nothing I want to edit out or cut down, and instead it's already a very tight, short narrative. And this is one that just really impresses me. It's possibly my favorite of his work at this point because I just think that it doesn't really do anything wrong and instead is all the great steps. I think it's super smart. I love the twists and turns in it, and it's a story that I find just really fills me with suspense and really makes me worry or care for this character. And at the same time geeking out about this really nuanced magic system that I found to be completely fascinating. So I highly recommend this one if you somehow haven't read it. Then at number 3, we have The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. And this is a standalone fantasy story that follows a unicorn who believes themselves to be the last unicorn, or at least doesn't know what happened to the rest of them. So they go on this epic adventure to try to find out where they went, and along the way they meet up with a sorcerer and other companions that try to help them with their quest. Now, Now, I fully admit that this is a story that is probably higher up on this list than it should be based off my personal taste because of the fact that I have a huge bias of nostalgia. I grew up watching the movie over and over again. I easily watched it at least once a month. We had a copy on VHS, and I am obsessed with that movie. It still holds up, at least for me as an adult. I think it's an amazing film with an amazing soundtrack. It gets me emotional and all of that. So picking up the book for the first time as an adult was a really incredible experience. The movie adaptation isn't that far off from the original source material, so having loved the plot points, the dialogue, and everything in the movie, it was very easy to love the book as well. Now, the reason I mentioned that I know I'm biased by nostalgia is that this book also has a lot of things I don't like. It is much more traditional fantasy. It's really talking about the narrative of the hero. And again, it's a story about unicorns. It's very traditional. It doesn't have the brutality in the same way that I tend to like newer fantasy that subverts the tropes. There definitely is a darkness to the story, and that is easily my favorite part. But at the same time, there's a lot of whimsy to the story. There are poems and songs in the story, which is usually a big no for me, but because I love the story so much, I was able to look past those parts that weren't normally to my taste and still look at them with fond memory. So if you are someone who perhaps loves traditional fantasy more than I do, I highly recommend this one. I think the prose is beautiful. The story itself, again, is emotional and just wonderful. It really, again, plays into a lot of the classic tropes of fantasies, but is almost making a conversation or discussion surrounding those themes and ideas in a way that felt very smart. And I can only imagine how progressive and new this would have felt when it first came out. Because in my mind, again, it's almost discussing the fantasy stories that you already know and love, and the hero's journey and what it means to sacrifice and all of those great things. And it's just a powerful read. So hopefully I'm selling you on it. And please not only read the book, but do watch the movie. It is incredible. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. Then at number 2, we have The Lies of Locke Lamora, as well as the sequel, Red Seas Under Red Sky, both of which were favorites of the year. This is a series that follows, of course, Locke Lamora as well as Jacques, and you follow them through their friendship. At the beginning of the story, Locke is being part of this group of thieves. They take him in and take him off the street, and they use his talents to try to make money and swindle people and so forth. And so this is a story that I love for a lot of reasons. I love that the characters are all very morally ambiguous. You have some characters at the beginning admitting to doing terrible things, and the idea that they are using these young orphan boys for their purposes and how it's somehow better than the alternative, even if the world that they're asking them to live in is pretty disgusting to be putting young boys in this situation to ask them to thieve and do all of this for you. But basically the world is even darker and more messed up, so this is actually seen as a compassionate choice for them. And so if you know me at all, you know that I love stories where the morals are really iffy and everything is set up with justifications and murkiness and all of that. It's right up my alley. So I love that to begin with. The character work, as everyone says, is fantastic. I really love Locke Lamora as well as his friend Jacques, and you have this bromance between the two of them that really carries the books because you care very deeply for both of them. You see them as very different people, but then in some ways they turn and start to complement each other. I would say that these books are relatively episodic, which I think is the biggest reason that people at this point are hesitant to pick up this series, is that they're so terrified that it's not finished. Honestly, if I'd only read the first book and there had been no more, it would have worked for me. It works as a complete work, and even with the second book I loved it as well, but I felt like this could have been an easy resting place for it. I like the third one, but not enough to really gush about on this video. I will read anything else that gets published, but I know that may not happen. But I really love the second book as well, because if you probably know, it has a pirate seafaring aspect to it, which I really love, and so I just had a really good time with these books. I can understand why they're not always everyone's favorite books, that I don't think they have the largest impact. Typically when a book becomes my favorite, it's because it leaves me thinking deeply about some horrible things that have happened and some great twists and turns. And instead, these ones almost feel comforting. While the world and the backdrop of these stories is horrific, the story themselves, the characters almost become like close friends. Certainly, again, there are characters that are not necessarily safe, terrible things happen, but there's almost a strange aspect of coziness to spending time with the characters that I kind of feel like you get by the second book. Again, if the next book comes comes out, I will happily read it, but if it never does, I'm really glad that I spent the time reading these first few because it was a really enjoyable time, and I don't think anyone should be scared off by the status of the series being incomplete because we should be happy with what we get. And finally, at the #1 spot, this is a fantasy series that I've been looking to beat out since the beginning of the year, and nothing has touched it. It is not only a favorite of the year, but definitely will become a new favorite series of all time. And that's the one that starts with The Trader Brewer Cormorant by Seth Dickinson. I've also read the next 2 books that are published. I believe the series is still slated to be a quartet. Tell me if that's wrong. But this is a series that follows a woman who, as a child, her nation was taken over by these other colonizers. And so they came in and they rewrote their history. They forbid and criminalized their customs and changed everything that they knew and loved, and basically conquered their city and nation from the inside. And so she grew up seeing the horrific ways that it tore her family apart. And so rather than running away or outright joining a rebellion, she decides to train up to become a financial leader and controller within the society. So you watch her within this first book as she becomes an accountant and works her way up into more and more political power. Now, what I love so much about the book is watching her move around and trying to gain a little bit more power, trying to influence other people, and all of that maneuvering just makes for a really fascinating story. It does help that I have a degree in business and have taken economic classes and so forth. So for me, those accounting aspects of the story were equally as interesting. I do recognize that other people might find them dry, but for me, this series is cutthroat because the character is forced to make terrible choices. And so this book is brutal and dark, and the main character is in a lot of ways unlikable because you can be sympathetic for her for where she comes from, but then she starts to make some choices that will make you question whether or not you're cheering for the right person. And I love, again, you can see it from this video, morally gray, ambiguous fantasy is my thing. So if you have more recommendations like this or any of the other books I mentioned on this list that involve gritty, dark worlds where characters do really bad things and we cheer for them anyway, that is what I love so much. So I love this first book, and I personally think that the next 2 are just as strong. Highly recommend them. Again, I hope the series gets finished, but I'm happy with what I got, and I hope more people pick it up. Again, it's a little dense in terms of the economics, but if you're a nerd like me, you might have a lot of fun with it. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know if the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And please let me know, what is your favorite fantasy book that you read this year? If I haven't read it yet, I'll try it out for next year. If you're new to my channel and want to stick around, subscribe. I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, and fantasy, and other dark things. And don't forget to check out the videos that are already out for my best of the year content, and stick around for when my best of 2023 videos come out closer to Christmas. If you want to help me out more with this video, you can give me a thumbs up. You can drop a comment, even if it's just a crown or a dragon or something fantasy like that. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.